My name is Bradley Thornfield, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was 35 years old, running a small furniture restoration shop in Denver. The kind of place where the smell of wood stain and linseed oil had seeped so deep into the walls that it greeted you before you even opened the door. I thought I knew my story. The disappointing eldest son of Harrison Thornfield, a real estate mogul worth $180 million, who built his empire from nothing and expected his children to be titans of industry. Instead, he got me, a man who preferred sawdust under his fingernails to cufflinks on his wrists, someone who found more satisfaction in bringing a broken, Victorian armchair back to life than in any boardroom. Deal. But everything I thought I knew shattered the night Harrison slapped me across the face at his 70th birthday party, in front of 200 people. The crack of his palm against my cheek echoed through the grand ballroom of his Aspen estate like a judge's gavel delivering a life sentence. "You're a disgrace to the family name," he roared, his voice carrying beneath the glittering chandeliers. Laughter rippled from the guests, awkward, cruel, entertained. Cameras were already out. I stood frozen, my face burning, my heart breaking. Then he said the words that changed everything. "You're cut off, Bradley. From me, from the company, from every dollar of my $180 million fortune." I remember the taste of champagne and salt, tears I didn't even realize were falling. I walked out into the freezing mountain air, the sound of laughter echoing behind me, unaware that by morning, my entire identity would be torn apart. I didn't sleep that night. The echo of that slap replayed in my head like a cursed melody. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, red with rage, veins pulsing at his temples, his voice shaking with contempt. For 35 years, I'd been the embarrassment of the Thornfield family, and that night, in front of 200 guests, he made sure the world knew it too. By morning, my phone was a battlefield. Texts, missed calls, notifications. A video of the slap had already gone viral in our social circles. Captions like "Thornfield family feud" and "Rich dad broke son" plastered across gossip sites. My younger brother Daniel hadn't even called. He just posted a photo on Instagram, him and Dad laughing with the caption, "Family first." I laughed when I saw it, a sharp, bitter laugh that hurt my throat. For as long as I can remember, I was the outlier. Daniel was the prodigy, Harvard graduate, hedge fund manager, the golden son who could do no wrong. My sister, Elaine, ran a successful interior design brand. And then there was me, the quiet craftsman who loved fixing things that no one else cared about. I used to think my father's anger came from love, that deep down, he wanted to understand me but didn't know how. But after that night, I realized the truth. He never saw me as a son, just a disappointment that refused to fit the mold he built. I packed a small bag that morning, a few clothes, my old sketchbook, and the watch my mother had given me when I was 15. She didn't say anything during the party. She just stood there frozen, like a porcelain statue afraid to crack. When I walked past her on my way out, she didn't meet my eyes. I told myself it didn't hurt, but it did. I drove back to Denver in silence. The mountain roads blurred as snowflakes danced against my windshield. By the time I reached my shop, the city was still asleep. I unlocked the door and stepped into the one place that still felt like mine. The air smelled of varnish, cedar dust, and old memories. My workbench was littered with half-repaired furniture, a cracked oak table, a rocking chair missing one arm. Somehow, fixing broken things always made me feel whole, but not that day. That morning, the weight of failure sat on my chest like a stone. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, sat on the cold concrete floor, and stared at my reflection in a piece of glass meant for a cabinet door. Who was I now? The man my father called a disgrace? The son without a family? The craftsman who'd lost everything except a shop that barely paid rent? I tried to convince myself I didn't care about the money, and maybe I didn't. But what cut deeper was the rejection, the final public declaration that I didn't belong. I scrolled through my phone again, message after message of pity and mockery. One caught my eye. It was from my father's lawyer, Richard Ames, a man who'd served the Thornfields for decades. The message was short. "Bradley, please contact me immediately. It's important." I ignored it. I assumed it was about the inheritance or the lack of it, but he called again. Then again. By the third call, curiosity won over pride. When I answered, his tone was calm, but there was something strange in it. Hesitation. "Bradley," he said quietly, "I need to meet with you. It's about your family, but not the Thornfields." That single sentence cut through my exhaustion like a knife. "What do you mean, not the Thornfields?" I asked. There was a pause. I heard papers rustling on his end. "Please," he said. Just come to my office in the morning. It's complicated. I didn't know it then, but that cat-haught I knew about my life. The next morning, the city felt strangely quiet. A thin layer of fog clung to the streets, and the usual buzz of downtown Denver sounded distant, almost muted. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept properly, but curiosity, and something deeper I couldn't name, kept me moving. Richard Ames's office sat on the top floor of an old sandstone building near Capitol Hill. I'd been there dozens of times growing up, always accompanying my father to sign documents I barely understood. This time, walking in alone, the space felt colder, emptier. The receptionist looked up from her desk and gave a nervous smile. "Mr. Ames is expecting you, Mr. Thornfield," she said. I could tell she'd seen the viral clip. Everyone had. Richard met me in the hallway before I reached his door. He looked older than I remembered. Gray hair thinned at the top, glasses slipping down his nose, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Bradley," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming." "I'm not here for any money," I replied, my voice flat. "If this is about my father cutting me off—" "It's not," he interrupted. "This isn't about Harrison Thornfield. Not at all." He gestured toward his office, and I followed him inside. Files were spread across his desk, papers stacked in uneven piles, a cup of untouched coffee gone cold beside them. He motioned for me to sit, then closed the door with a soft click that somehow sounded final. "Before I show you anything," he began, "I need you to understand this. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room until you're ready." I frowned. "You're starting to sound like a spy movie, Richard." He didn't smile. Instead, he opened a manila folder and slid it across the desk toward me. Inside were several documents, old hospital records, a faded birth certificate, and what looked like a DNA report. "I don't understand," I said, flipping through the pages. "What is this?" He folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Bradley, you were never legally adopted by the Thornfields." The words hit me like a punch. "That's not possible. My name is on the birth certificate." He shook his head slowly. "That certificate was falsified." My chest tightened. "By who?" He hesitated, then said, "By someone working inside a private hospital in Aspen 35 years ago. The real Bradley Thornfield, Harrison and Margaret's biological son, was stillborn. The doctors told them he died. But that wasn't true." I felt my breath catch. "You're saying I'm not their son?" Richard met my eyes. "No, Bradley. You were taken from another family. A family that's been searching for their missing child for more than 3 decades. My stomach turned. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I looked at the papers again, the hospital name, the dates. Everything lined up with my birth year. There was even a photo clipped to one corner, a grainy image of a woman in a hospital gown, holding a newborn, smiling at the camera. Written beneath it in neat handwriting were 3 words. Eleanor Rhodes, Mother Rhodes. I'd never heard that name before, but seeing it felt like déjà vu, as if some forgotten part of me recognized it. "I know this is overwhelming," Richard said, his tone softening. "But the people who hired me are waiting to meet you. They've been trying to find their son since 1990. They never stopped." I pushed the folder back toward him, my hands trembling. "How can I believe any of this?" He slid another paper forward, a DNA comparison. My name, matched against a man named Edward Rhodes. A 99-98% match. The room spun. I leaned back in the chair, my mind splintering into 1,000 fragments. "If this is true," I whispered, "then who am I?" Richard's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "You're not Bradley Thornfield, heir to a real estate empire. You're Adam Rhodes, the kidnapped son of Edward and Eleanor Rhodes." Outside, the fog thickened against the window. Inside, my entire life dissolved in silence. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the DNA results. My brain refused to process what my eyes were reading. Every letter on that page seemed to float, blur, and rearrange itself into something incomprehensible. Finally, I looked up at Richard, my voice barely a whisper. "You're telling me my whole life is a lie?" He nodded slowly. "I wish I weren't." I pushed back my chair and stood, pacing the office. "This doesn't make sense. Harrison Thornfield may be cruel, but he's not a kidnapper. He couldn't have." Richard held up a hand. "He didn't. At least not directly. From what we've uncovered, the adoption, or rather, the abduction, was orchestrated by a woman named Clara Doyle. She was a nurse at Aspen Valley Hospital the night you were born. The Rhodes family's baby was taken from the nursery shortly after delivery. Clara falsified records, swapped identification tags, and smuggled the infant out under the pretense of transferring him for specialized care. That baby was you." My mouth went dry. And the Thornfields? He sighed. Margaret Thornfield had multiple miscarriages before. Doctors told her she couldn't conceive again. Harrison was desperate for an heir. Clara had connections to a discreet underground adoption ring. Harrison thought it was a legal private adoption, but it wasn't. Everything was hidden behind forged paperwork and bribes. The office felt colder by the second. My hands shook as I tried to absorb the words. So they didn't know? Richard hesitated. At first, no. But years later, when a journalist investigating the hospital scandal started digging around, Harrison found out the truth. Rather than come forward, he buried it. He didn't want the Thornfield name tainted by a kidnapping scandal. The air left my lungs, the slap, the humiliation, the disgust in his eyes. Suddenly, it all made sense. He found out, and that's why he hates me. Richard's silence confirmed it. I sank back into the chair, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. And the Rhodes family? Who are they? He opened another file, revealing a photograph of a middle-aged couple. The woman's kind eyes mirrored the ones from the old hospital photo. The man beside her had the same tired determination I'd seen in my own reflection. Edward and Eleanor Rhodes, Richard said quietly. He's a retired aerospace engineer. She runs a small community art gallery in Chicago. They've been searching for you since the night you disappeared. I reached for the photo, my hands trembling. I didn't know these people, yet something deep in my chest twisted painfully, like a memory trying to surface after years underwater. Richard continued. They hired private investigators for decades. Most leads went nowhere. Then, when DNA testing became widespread, they submitted their genetic data to a private registry. 2 months ago, it matched with a background test you did when applying for a business license. I froze. I remembered taking a simple ancestry test years ago, more out of curiosity than anything. I'd forgotten all about it. The universe, it seemed, hadn't. I stared at the photo again. They know? I asked softly. Yes, Richard replied. And they're desperate to meet you. They asked me to deliver this. He handed me a small envelope, its edges worn from handling. Inside was a handwritten note. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, and full of emotion. My dearest Adam, not a day has passed that we haven't prayed for you. We don't know what kind of life you've lived, but we've never stopped believing you were alive. If you're reading this, please know that you are loved, you were never abandoned, and you were never forgotten. Mom and Dad, Eleanor and Edward. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink. For the first time in my life, I felt something I couldn't explain. Grief and joy colliding, a strange sense of belonging that both terrified and comforted me. Richard's voice broke the silence. They're flying into Denver tomorrow. They'd like to meet you privately. I folded the letter gently, holding it to my chest. My voice was barely audible. Tell them, yes. And just like that, my old life ended. And the truth, the real unbearable truth, had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night either. The letter from Eleanor and Edward lay open on my kitchen table, lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. I must have read it 100 times, tracing every curve of her handwriting, every smudge of ink where her tears must have fallen. My dearest Adam. The name still didn't feel like mine. Yet somehow, it pulled at something inside me, like a door I didn't know existed had cracked open. Outside, snow drifted past the window, muting the city sounds. Inside, my world was painfully loud, memories colliding, rewiring themselves. The slap, the humiliation, my father's disgust. Now, every cruel word made a strange, awful kind of sense. When morning came, I almost didn't go. I stood by the door for what felt like hours, debating whether to meet the people who claimed to be my real parents. What if this was some elaborate scam? What if they weren't who they said they were? But then I looked at the letter again, and the photograph of Eleanor holding her newborn son. The resemblance was undeniable. By the time I arrived at Richard's office, my palms were sweating. The door to the conference room was slightly ajar. I could hear quiet voices inside, a man's low murmur, a woman's nervous laugh that trembled with emotion. Richard met me at the door and gave a small nod. They're ready. When I stepped inside, time seemed to slow. Eleanor Rhodes stood first. She was smaller than I expected, her hair silver at the edges, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. Her eyes, those soft hazel eyes, were identical to mine. Beside her, Edward Rhodes straightened his posture, as if trying to hold himself together, but his eyes were already wet. For a second, none of us moved. The air between us was electric, fragile. Then Eleanor whispered, "Adam?" Her voice cracked on the second syllable. I couldn't answer. My throat tightened. All I could do was nod. She crossed the room slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. When she finally reached me, she stopped just inches away, as if afraid I might vanish. Then she reached out, touching my face gently, her fingers trembling. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's really you." And suddenly, I wasn't 35 anymore. I was a child again, lost, broken, searching for warmth I never found. I didn't know who moved first, but then we were hugging, her sobs muffled against my shoulder, Edward's hand gripping mine like he was afraid to let go. No words could fill those 35 years. There was only the sound of crying, of breathing, of hearts trying to remember how to beat in sync again. When we finally sat down, Richard quietly left the room. Eleanor wiped her eyes and smiled through tears. "You look just like your father," she said softly. "Even that stubborn jaw." Edward chuckled faintly. "I see my eyes, though. He's got my eyes." I didn't know how to respond. I just stared at them, overwhelmed by the warmth radiating from people I'd never met. They didn't ask for proof. They didn't demand explanations. They simply knew. After a long silence, Edward spoke again. "We tried everything, Adam. The police, private investigators, even the FBI. They all told us the same thing, that you were gone. But Eleanor never gave up." "I couldn't," she said, shaking her head. "A mother knows. I always knew you were alive." Her words broke me. Tears blurred my vision again. But this time, they weren't out of shame or pain. They were out of love. A kind of love I'd never known. We talked for hours, about their lives, their home in Chicago. The way they celebrated my birthday every year, even when there was no one to blow out the candles. They showed me photos of my would-be childhood, of a room kept untouched, waiting for me to return. As I listened, one truth became painfully clear. While the Thornfields raised me, they never truly loved me. The Rhodes family, on the other hand, loved a ghost, and never stopped. And now that ghost had finally come home. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt something that resembled peace. It wasn't the loud, triumphant kind. It was quiet, fragile, the kind that makes you afraid to breathe too hard in case it disappears. I sat across from Edward and Eleanor in that softly lit office, listening to their voices like they were songs I'd forgotten the lyrics to. Every sentence filled an empty space I hadn't realized existed. Eleanor told me about the night I was born. Snow had fallen heavy that evening, she said, blanketing Chicago in white. Their son, I, had been born healthy, crying and kicking. But the next morning, when the nurse came to check on me, the bassinet was empty. Panic, sirens, police, chaos. The hospital staff claimed a mix-up, then a tragedy. The baby had died in transport due to complications. There had been a funeral, but no body. They buried an empty coffin. I felt my stomach turn as she spoke. It was the kind of story you hear in documentaries or true crime podcasts, not something that belonged to you. Edward's hands shook slightly as he added, "They told us we needed to move on. But every year, Eleanor would light a candle in that room. Every year, she'd say, 'He's still out there.'" I didn't know how to respond. "I don't know how to make up for that," I finally said, my voice breaking. Eleanor reached across the table, taking my hand. "You don't have to make up for anything," she said. "You're home. That's enough." For a while, none of us spoke. The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy but comforting. I had spent my life chasing a father's approval, trying to earn love that was never freely given. Now, sitting here, I realized I didn't have to chase anymore. Still, part of me couldn't let go of the other family, the Thornfields. For all their cruelty, they were the only family I'd ever known. "What happens now?" I asked Richard, who'd re-entered quietly. "Legally, I mean." He cleared his throat. "There will be an investigation, of course. The evidence is overwhelming: DNA, hospital records, witness statements. Once this goes public, the Thornfield name will be at the center of it all." I flinched at that. Harrison didn't steal me himself. He just didn't tell anyone once he knew. "Which makes him complicit," Richard said gently. "He could have come forward. He chose to bury it." Edward's jaw tightened. "He let us suffer for decades. He deserves whatever comes." But I didn't feel anger, not anymore. Just exhaustion, the kind that sinks deep into your bones. "I don't want revenge," I said quietly. "I just want the truth." Eleanor smiled sadly. "That's exactly why we wanted to find you. Not to punish anyone, just to make our family whole again." After the meeting, we went to lunch together. It was surreal, sitting in a quiet diner with people who looked like strangers, yet felt like family. Edward ordered too much food, insisting I needed to eat properly. Eleanor kept studying my face like she was memorizing every detail. I couldn't blame her. I was doing the same. When we finished, she handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a silver locket with a baby's photo, me, taken the day I was born. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, were the words, "You are loved beyond measure." I slipped it into my pocket, unable to speak. That night, back at my apartment, I sat by the window holding the locket, staring at the city lights. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a disappointment. I didn't feel small or forgotten. I felt real. And even though my world had just been turned upside down, something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of everything I was meant to be. It didn't take long for the truth to explode. Within a week, news outlets caught wind of the story. Headlines blared across every major platform. Multimillionaire's son was kidnapped as a baby, real heir found after 35 years. My phone became a weapon, vibrating with messages, interview requests, and journalists clawing for statements. The world suddenly wanted a piece of me. The man who wasn't who he thought he was. I ignored most of it. I wanted to hide, to stay cocooned in the fragile calm I'd found with the Rhodes family. But some truths don't stay quiet, no matter how much you beg them to. The legal storm came fast. The state opened an investigation into the Thornfields, the hospital, and anyone connected to the abduction. Harrison Thornfield, my former father, was summoned for questioning. For days I avoided the news, until one morning I saw him on live television. He looked older, frailer, the arrogance drained from his face. A swarm of reporters surrounded him as he stepped out of his mansion. One shouted, "Mr. Thornfield, did you know your son was kidnapped?" Harrison paused, jaw tight. "No," he said coldly. "I was lied to, just like everyone else." But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes I used to fear, betrayed something else. Guilt. Later that day, Richard called. "Bradley, sorry, Adam. There's something you need to see," he said. "Meet me at my office. It's about the Thornfield investigation." When I arrived, he looked grim. He pressed play on an audio file, the sound faint but clear. A man's voice, familiar, deep, spoke nervously. "It's true," Mr. Thornfield knew. "I told him everything years ago, but he ordered me to destroy the files. He said if this ever came out, it would ruin him." I froze. It was the voice of Victor Hensley, my father's former assistant, the man who'd been at his side for decades. Richard muted the recording. "The police got this from a whistleblower," he said. "They have enough evidence to charge Harrison with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal a crime." For a long time, I said nothing. I just stared at the desk, my heart twisting in ways I couldn't untangle. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. Another part wanted to cry. "So it's true," I said finally. "He knew I wasn't his son, and he kept it quiet to protect his empire." Richard nodded slowly. He tried to erase the truth, but now it's all coming undone. By the end of that week, Harrison Thornfield's empire began to crumble. Business partners distanced themselves. Stocks plummeted. The man who once commanded fear and respect now faced public shame and legal consequences. Still, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. As strange as it sounded, a part of me still remembered the nights when he'd sit at my bedside when I was sick, or when he'd silently fix the latch on my bike because he knew I wouldn't ask for help. Maybe those moments were guilt. Maybe they were love, twisted and buried beneath pride. When the subpoena arrived for me to testify, I hesitated. Eleanor and Edward told me I didn't have to go through with it. But deep down, I knew I needed closure. The courtroom was packed when I took the stand. Harrison sat just a few feet away, his eyes locked on me. For the first time, he looked small, like the power that had once filled the room around him had finally drained away. The prosecutor asked if I wanted to address the defendant directly. My voice trembled as I said yes. I looked at the man who had raised me, loved me in his own broken way, and destroyed me in another. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. "I just wish you'd told me the truth. I spent my life thinking I wasn't enough, when really I just didn't belong." His eyes glistened for a split second before he turned away. That moment wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was release. And for the first time since the slap, I could finally breathe. After the trial, the world seemed to move on. But I couldn't. Reporters eventually found another story to chase, and the Thornfield scandal faded from the front page. Yet the silence that followed felt louder than any headline. I had my freedom, my truth, and a real family that welcomed me home. But I also carried a hollow ache that no verdict or apology could fill. Eleanor and Edward did everything they could to make me feel grounded again. My old room, or rather Adam's room, had been carefully preserved. Baseball trophies, childhood drawings, photos of a life I never got to live. Each item felt like a reminder of two parallel worlds that were never supposed to intersect. Some nights, I'd sit at my workshop bench, running my fingers over the grain of a half-repaired chair, and think about how wood had always told me stories, scars, burns, stains, imperfections that gave it character. Maybe that's what I was now, a scarred piece of life, made stronger by the repair. Then, one evening, I got an unexpected letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Harrison Thornfield's. My pulse quickened as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, written in his stiff, careful script. "Bradley, Gay, or Adam, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know the truth before my time runs out. I didn't plan your kidnapping, but I knew years later when the rumors surfaced. By then, I'd already lost my first son to illness, and I couldn't face losing another. So I kept you. I told myself I was protecting you, that I'd give you a better life. I was wrong. I'm dying, and my only wish is that you find peace, even if it's not with me. HT." I sat frozen, reading the letter again and again until the ink blurred through my tears. For the first time I saw him not as the monster who humiliated me, but as a broken man terrified of loss. Maybe he hadn't stolen me out of greed, but out of grief. The next morning I drove to the hospice center listed at the bottom of the page. When I entered his room, the powerful mogul I'd feared all my life looked fragile, tubes running from his arms, oxygen hissing softly beside him. His eyes fluttered open when he heard my voice. "Bradley," he whispered. "You came." I swallowed hard. "It's Adam now," he smiled faintly. "Adam, that's a good name." For a moment we just looked at each other. No wealth, no legacy, no anger. Just two men, bound by something painful and strange. He reached out a trembling hand. I took it. "I wanted to hate you," I said quietly. "But I can't." He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to love without control." Minutes later, he was gone. I stood there, still, holding his hand, realizing that forgiveness isn't something you give to the other person. It's something you give to yourself, so you can finally move forward. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, warm and blinding. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't Bradley Thornfield, or even Adam Rhodes. I was simply me. And maybe that was enough. The weeks after Harrison's passing felt strangely quiet, like the storm had finally burned itself out. His funeral was private, attended only by family and a handful of business associates. There were no headlines, no cameras, no reporters fighting for a statement. Just the sound of the wind brushing through the aspens and the steady crackle of the priest's voice. I stood a few steps back from the casket, unsure of where I fit. Was I the son saying goodbye, or the stranger who had accidentally lived another man's life? Eleanor and Edward stood beside me, their hands clasped around mine, grounding me when my emotions wanted to drift into chaos. After the ceremony, Richard approached quietly. "There's something you should know," he said. "Harrison left a letter for you with his estate lawyer. It's not about money. It's something else." Later that day, I met with the attorney, who handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was another note written in Harrison's precise handwriting. "Adam, I have left you nothing material. You don't need it. You've built your own life, something I never could. But I have left you one thing, the workshop. I had it restored after you left. I figured you might want it, whether to destroy it or to start again. Maybe that's what life is, restoration, Harrison." My breath caught in my throat. The workshop, the same one where I had spent years sanding, carving, and mending what was broken. Both furniture and, unknowingly, myself. When I visited it the next morning, it was exactly as I'd left it. Dust motes floated through the sunlight slanting across the windows. My old tools hung neatly on the wall. The faint smell of varnish still lingered. It felt like stepping into a memory. Or perhaps into closure. I walked to the center of the room and ran my fingers along the workbench. There was something symbolic about it. This place where I had created beauty from ruin, just as my life had done to me. In the weeks that followed, I decided to reopen the shop. Not as Thornfield Restoration, the name I'd once used to cling to my father's approval, but as Second Chance Studio. The name felt right, not just for the furniture, but for me. Eleanor and Edward came to visit during the grand reopening. Edward hugged me tight and said, "You know, your real father would be proud. Not for what you do, but for who you became." For the first time, I didn't cry. I just smiled. Life slowly began to find rhythm again. I started taking on apprentices, teaching them the art of restoring what others thought was beyond repair. Every nail, every stroke of varnish, every grain of wood reminded me of how fragile and how resilient human life could be. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself thinking about both of my fathers. Harrison, the man who raised me in lies but still gave me a strange kind of love. And Edward, the man who lost me but never stopped searching. Two men on opposite ends of morality, yet both somehow responsible for the person I'd become. I realized then that life isn't about who we come from. It's about what we build from the pieces we're given. Before closing the shop one evening, I picked up my father's old hammer, the one Harrison had once used to teach me how to drive a nail straight. I set it beside my own, side by side on the bench, past and present, pain and peace, both part of the same story. And in that quiet moment, I finally understood what restoration truly meant. Not fixing what's broken, but accepting that it was never perfect to begin with. Months passed, and life finally began to feel normal again. Not the old normal I once knew, but something quieter, simpler, and more honest. Denver's mornings felt brighter, the smell of wood polish comforting rather than nostalgic. My shop, Second Chance Studio, was thriving, but more than that, it had become a haven for stories. People bringing in their broken heirlooms, each one carrying a piece of pain, history, or love. Sometimes, when I'd hand a restored chair or table back to its owner, I'd see a spark in their eyes. That moment when something lost was made whole again. It reminded me of my own journey. One afternoon, a young man came in with a small music box, its lid cracked and mechanism rusted. "It was my dad's," he said softly. "He died last year." I took the box, nodded, and smiled. "Then let's bring it back to life." As I worked on it, I realized that what I did wasn't just about wood or metal. It was about connection, healing, understanding that sometimes broken things aren't meant to be discarded. They're meant to be rebuilt. When I finished, I wound the box, and the soft melody filled the room. The man's eyes welled up and he whispered, "It sounds just like I remember." After he left, I stood alone in the golden afternoon light, listening to the fading tune. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel lost between two worlds. I wasn't Harrison's son or Edward's missing child. I wasn't a victim or a name in a headline. I was simply Adam Rhodes, a man who had been broken, found, and restored. And maybe that was the greatest inheritance of all.